Hey guys, tonight we slipped back into a Rome that looked pristine on the outside. Gleaming columns, triumphal arches, statues flexing marble muscles. But beneath the fanfare, the city ran on improvisation and audacity more than order. Picture cobbled streets that were uneven enough to make your ankles reconsider life choices, vendors shouting over one another in a symphony of bargaining, and the Tiber glinting deceptively calm while hosting a silent parade of goods, debris, and unwelcome surprises floating downstream. It was an empire that wanted to flex sophistication, but was still figuring out that modern plumbing was not a suggestion. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment with your location and local time, because it's always wild imagining who's tuning in from a different time zone while we tour a 2,000-year-old city. Now, settle in and get comfortable, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Rome had grown on ambition, trade, and brute persistence, and that same persistence shaped how humans coexisted with chaos. Merchants lined the streets with exotic produce, pottery, and fabrics, negotiating prices while children darted between legs with reckless optimism, acrobatic enough to survive a city where infrastructure hadn't fully caught up with population density. Traffic was its own ecosystem, carts, pack animals, and pedestrians moving in patterns that resembled strategy games played by someone slightly drunk. The contrast between polished forums and the lived-in reality of insulae above them was stark. Marble proclaimed permanence, while the apartment blocks whispered stories of overcrowding, makeshift repairs, and improvisation. Water ran through aqueducts with precision, but delivery was only half the battle. How humans collected, stored, and shared, it was subject to creativity, neglect, and occasional genius. The city smelled of ambition and dust, of sweat and incense, of cooked grain and urban determination, blending into a perfume no one had bottled yet. Citizens adapted, stepping lightly over uneven stone, memorizing which corners were best for crossing, haggling with vendors in tones that combined charm and menace. In every alley, Rome's dual personality revealed itself, grand, structured, triumphant on the surface, stubbornly human and unpredictable beneath. Even the smallest details mattered. A roof tile slightly askew could redirect rain into a courtyard, a misjudged cart could block an alley, and a distracted citizen could redefine traffic rules entirely. The city functioned as a living organism, chaotic and glorious, its residents continuously negotiating between ambition, practicality, and survival, proving that civilization didn't require perfection, it required stamina, wit, and a little luck. From the uneven streets and hustling markets, the city's heartbeat traveled upward to the soaring aqueducts, those marble and brick arteries delivering water like Rome's personal veins, impressively engineered, but also slightly naive about human behavior. The same citizens who danced between carts and dodged vendors now relied on this flowing miracle for drinking, cooking, and washing, though no one could guarantee that it stayed as pure as the engineers promised. Water gushed into fountains, public basins, and private homes, providing a constant spectacle of engineering bravado, and Romans flaunted it like a badge of sophistication while treating storage and handling with the enthusiasm of someone juggling knives blindfolded. Household tanks, barrels, and lead pipes distributed water with varying degrees of success. Some wealthier homes enjoyed indoor taps that made servants run for cover when valves leaked. In poorer districts, residents relied on communal fountains, dipping buckets and bottles into streams that had already been visited by a half-dozen other hands that morning. Maintenance was occasional, discretionary, and often postponed until failure became spectacularly obvious, which in practice meant leaks, overflows, and spontaneous puddles inside homes or along streets. People adapted, of course. Daily routines accounted for the quirks of supply, from timing bucket refills before noon to navigating wet patches in tight corridors, all while pretending the system was flawlessly efficient. Even food preparation depended on these pipes. Bakers, cooks, and butchers exploited fountains or cisterns for washing produce or cleaning tools, blurring lines between engineering triumph and urban improvisation. Public fountains became social hubs where citizens exchanged gossip, deals, and minor insults, their hands dunking into the same basins, unconcerned about microscopic consequences. Children, naturally, experimented with splashing floating scraps of paper or launching miniature boats made from whatever happened to be lying around, adding a touch of chaos to the carefully calculated flow. Meanwhile, artisans and workshop owners sometimes diverted water into channels to help carry away excess debris or runoff, showing ingenuity but also demonstrating that infrastructure alone could not manage the human component. The aqueducts were brilliant, monumental, and almost miraculous, yet they depended entirely on people who were brilliant, unpredictable, and sometimes careless. In that way, Rome's water system mirrored the city itself, engineered with ambition, decorated with pride, and lived in with improvisation. The grandeur of stone arches soaring over streets connected neatly to the mundane reality below, reminding everyone that technology was only as effective as the humans who touched it. Flowing water, public pride, private struggle, all existed side by side, creating a rhythm of life that required attention, timing, and a dash of optimism to navigate successfully. The citizens' adaptation to this delicate balance was as essential to the city's survival as the aqueducts themselves, a partnership of ingenuity and tolerance that kept Rome functioning at scale. Following the water from the fountains and cisterns, citizens often funneled directly into Rome's bathhouses, massive, steam-filled complexes that acted as both hygiene centers and social arenas, a combination of spa, networking hub, and occasional gossip factory. Marble and mosaic floors gleamed under torchlight, and hypercaust systems puffed heat up from beneath, warming rooms with calculated intensity. Though the strategic brilliance didn't extend to changing water between hundreds of bathers, a detail that would have made any modern germaphobe reconsider their career choices. Romans entered through the tepidarium, letting skin adjust to moderate warmth before moving into the caldarium, a hot room dense enough to make breath visible and patience optional. From there, the daring, or socially ambitious, ventured into the frigidarium, a cold plunge that shocked muscles awake and reminded visitors that life involved choices, some of which were unwise. Slaves moved through these spaces with practiced efficiency, scrubbing floors, collecting oils, and occasionally muttering at the combination of crowding and steam, a chorus of subtle commentary against the illusion of perfection. Patrons applied olive oil to skin before scraping it off with strigils, a process that left residue in the water, on benches, and occasionally on anyone within arm's reach, making communal bathing a performance of tact, timing, and luck. Conversations floated above the hissing water. Senators negotiated politics, merchants discussed deals, and gossip ran rampant with no concept of privacy, proving that hygiene and discretion were rarely compatible. Courtyards and palaestrae adjoining the baths allowed exercise, wrestling, and ball games, adding a layer of grit and sweat that, while technically outdoors, inevitably found its way back into the complex. Perfumes, incense, and oils attempted to mask reality, but the environment demanded acceptance more than olfactory bravery. For many, The baths represented a ritual of civilization, a daily attempt at refinement in a city whose streets, markets, and homes constantly reminded citizens that perfection was optional. The architecture amplified the contrast. Vaulted ceilings and polished marble set against the human propensity for mess, creating an arena where social hierarchy, pride, and the practicalities of cleaning coexisted awkwardly but persistently. Emerging from the baths, Romans faced streets still bustling, steps still slick, and the city's rhythm continuing, proving that cleanliness, social ritual, and civic life were intertwined, messy, and gloriously unavoidable. The water that began its journey in distant aqueducts had passed through triumphs of engineering, collective improvisation, and personal rituals, leaving behind a trail of ambition, adaptation, and subtle chaos. Each bather, consciously or not, navigated this flow, contributing to a living system that balanced design with unpredictability, sociality with practicality, and aspiration with stubborn human reality. Exiting the warm, steam-filled corridors of the baths, Romans returned to their homes, if homes applied to the dense insulae that rose like stacked boxes along the city's narrow streets. These multi-story apartment blocks were a marvel of population maximization, with upper floors often cheaper, smaller, and less structurally reliable, leaning slightly into the wind as if whispering warnings no one could afford to heed. Families packed into single rooms, improvising storage and sleeping arrangements that required choreography rivaling any gladiatorial combat, because a misplaced chair or bundle of bedding could block a stairwell or a neighbor's doorway. Cooking happened on tiny hearths, smoke venting unpredictably through gaps or chimneys that sometimes doubled as vertical ventilation shafts for the whole building, an architectural gamble with aroma consequences for everyone else. Communal latrines perched along corridors or roof edges, demanding negotiation between convenience, discretion, and neighborly patience, while chamber pots waited for collection or disposal by hands more tolerant than squeamish. Fire was a constant concern, both from stoves and lamps, with wooden floors and crowded stairwells creating a subtle, unspoken risk that everyone mentally acknowledged and then ignored because survival required focus elsewhere. Children played in corridors, sharing space with animals, laundry, and the occasional unstable balcony railing, learning agility, diplomacy, and balance in a way that school curricula could never teach. Water from aqueducts or rooftop cisterns was rationed carefully. Baths had ended, but daily domestic use demanded timing and attention, turning simple chores into practiced routines. Noise traveled easily through thin walls, carrying arguments, announcements, and gossip, so privacy was a courtesy rather than an expectation. Meanwhile, wealthier neighbors on lower floors or in the domus observed from courtyards or terraces, marveling at how much humanity could exist in such compact arrangements, sometimes offering aid, sometimes quietly judging, but always participating in the same underlying struggle of adaptation. The insulae reflected the city's dual nature perfectly, impressive in scale, efficient in concept, yet perpetually negotiating chaos with creativity and tolerance. Residents modified floors with rugs, boards, or raised platforms, creating microzones of control in an otherwise unpredictable environment, while the constant hum of life, children, animals, deliveries, cooking, reminded everyone that urban density demanded coordination and improvisation. Life in these vertical neighborhoods required skill, patience, and negotiation. The city's grandeur descended from such daily compromises, a network of stacked human stories, practical problem-solving, and informal social contracts that kept thousands thriving despite the limitations of space, infrastructure, and domestic design. In this way, Rome's apartment life was not merely habitation, it was training in urban survival, a testament to adaptation as much as civilization. Stepping out from the cramped corridors and stairwells of the insulae, citizens spilled into the markets, a cacophony of motion, noise, and organized chaos that transformed ordinary goods into spectacles of trade. Merchants arranged their stalls with meticulous care, or at least the illusion of it, displaying baskets of fruit, piles of grain, and slabs of meat that glinted under the sun as if auditioning for a still life painting. Buyers navigated narrow aisles, negotiating prices while avoiding carts, animals, and the occasional apprentice delivering a crate with more enthusiasm than skill. Vendors shouted over one another, offering promises that ranged from miraculous freshness to guaranteed yesterday, a subtle exercise in optimism over precision. Fish lay on wooden tables, ice an unthinkable concept, relying on salt, brine, and human faith to preserve it long enough to leave the stall with dignity intact. Bakers spread dough over counters dusted with flour, sometimes inhaled in amounts that left nostrils coated, while grains from mills, powered by animals or water wheels, flew like golden mist, clinging to skin and clothing in the most democratic way possible. Wine merchants poured samples with flair, the color rich and tempting, and bread sellers offered crusty loaves that promised sustenance and minor victories over hunger. Street animals, dogs, cats, and occasionally pigs, negotiated their place in the ecosystem, scavenging bits, dodging carts, and adding their own contribution to the vibrant mix, a reminder that commerce and life were inseparable. Citizens moved with practiced agility, balancing purchases, avoiding collisions, and silently judging the technique of a neighbor's negotiation while marveling at the sheer volume of trade crammed into irregular streets. Storage methods varied. Wealthy households relied on amphorae sealed with pitch for wine and olive oil, while poorer families improvised, tucking grain or preserved foods into small containers or hidden corners, hoping neither rats nor humidity discovered their secret. The market's rhythm dictated the city's pulse, synchronizing delivery, preparation, and consumption with an efficiency that relied as much on habit and human adaptability as on organization or law. Every transaction was a negotiation of trust, skill, and timing, a microcosm of Rome itself, ambitious, chaotic, and incredibly resourceful. It was in these bustling spaces that citizens witnessed the delicate balance between abundance and risk, learning to evaluate freshness, negotiate hazards, and navigate both human and animal actors with subtle competence. Markets didn't merely sell goods, they taught survival, social skill, and the limits of perception, reminding everyone that civilization was built on layers of coordination, improvisation, and persistent attention to detail. The streets and insula behind them were the training ground. The market was the proving arena, connecting domestic life with commerce, ambition with daily ritual, and highlighting the human ingenuity that kept Rome functioning at every level of scale. Amid the bustling markets, animals carved out their own unofficial districts, moving with a confidence that humans had long since learned to negotiate around. Dogs padded between stalls with a casual sense of ownership, tails flicking at distracted shoppers while occasionally snatching a stray loaf or chunk of fruit, earning only mild curses or resigned chuckles. Cats prowled the edges, sleek and patient, timing their interventions for unattended scraps, mouse chases, or daring adventures atop stacked crates, every move calibrated to survival and opportunity. Horses, indispensable for carts and deliveries, clattered through alleys and squares with a sense of purpose that could only be described as apocalyptic in slow motion, leaving hoof prints that became both pathways and hazards for those brave enough to cross. Chickens scratched at grain spilled near stalls, their sudden flaps of wings startling humans into frantic sidesteps, while pigs occasionally wandered from butcher stalls, sniffing the air with a single-minded determination that left citizens politely giving way. Livestock arrived daily with traders, tethered and vocal, sometimes spooking crowds, occasionally colliding with each other, and always reminding the city that life in Rome depended on negotiation with species other than your own. Markets became miniature ecosystems, humans adapting their movement, speech, and balance to coexist with these creatures, while vendors adjusted coals, prices, and placement to account for non-human interventions. Even water, once flowing predictably from aqueducts, became a variable. Animals drank, splashed, or trampled shallow puddles, subtly reshaping traffic and commerce, and citizens learned to incorporate these micro-disruptions into their routines. Beyond the markets, street-dwelling animals maintained informal patrols, scavenging refuse and leftovers, performing an unappreciated service of reducing waste while simultaneously creating minor new challenges. Cats hunted rats, dogs deterred other scavengers, and pigs, when left unchecked, reintroduced chaos in concentrated bursts, all under the watchful, half-amused eyes of humans who had accepted that adaptation was not optional. In insulae and homes, domesticated animals added another layer. Small dogs curled under tables, birds nested in lofts, and every household found ways to coexist without descending into total disorder. The interplay of commerce, human behavior, and animal agency highlighted a city functioning through constant negotiation, observation, and improvisation. It was a delicate balance. Too many animals in the wrong place, and chaos erupted. Too little human adaptation, and opportunity, or disaster, was wasted. Life in Rome was not just about surviving human complexity. It required fluency in interspecies, diplomacy, spatial awareness, and strategic thinking, all performed daily on the streets, in markets, and within homes. In this way, animals were not mere companions or tools. They were cohabitants, co-conspirators, and constant variables in the city's relentless, unpredictable choreography, proving that Roman ingenuity was as much about human-animal negotiation as about marble, aqueducts, or law. While animals negotiated their daily routines on streets and in markets, the city below worked in parallel, less graceful, but just as essential. The sewers, canals, and drains that channeled waste, runoff, and occasional surprises out of sight, or at least out of immediate consciousness. The Cloaca Maxima, Rome's grand sewer, stretched like a shadowy backbone beneath streets, an engineering triumph whose design seemed to whisper, "We've got this," and then promptly proved that human and animal behavior could outsmart stonework. Residents above rarely considered the underground arteries until a heavy rain transformed a clogged drain into a minor urban geyser, or a careless cart dumped refuse too close to an inlet, creating a slow-motion plumbing rebellion. Street animals, oblivious to engineering, occasionally contributed. A pig wallowed in a shallow gutter, a dog chased a rat into an open channel, and birds flitted across the stone arches, scattering debris into access points. Merchants and residents adapted, stepping carefully over drains, adjusting delivery routes, and timing daily routines around predictable surges of water and detritus. Maintenance crews and slaves descended periodically, shovels and baskets in hand, wading through dark tunnels filled with water, mud, and whatever else had decided to travel downward, earning both awe and horror in equal measure. Public perception treated the sewers as miraculous, yet slightly intimidating. a hidden world that kept life moving above while reminding citizens of the persistent reality that infrastructure was only part of civilization. Human unpredictability remained undefeated. Even the most carefully stored water or meticulously cleaned floors could not escape the connection to the channels below. What happened underground inevitably influenced life above, whether through odor, overflow, or sudden discoveries of forgotten refuse. Engineers boasted about gradients, vaulted ceilings, and stonework, yet no amount of precision could entirely counteract improvisation, negligence, or curiosity from those living overhead. The city's rhythm depended on this constant negotiation. Waste flowed, animals interacted with it inadvertently. Humans adapted routes, schedules, and behaviors to coexist with hidden systems operating silently, efficiently, and sometimes rebelliously. In essence, the sewers were both protector and reminder, a marvel of Roman ambition, a partner in adaptation, and a subtle antagonist in everyday life. They symbolize the tension between human aspiration and daily chaos, engineering and improvisation, civilization and its inevitable mess, proving that even beneath monumental forums and temples, Rome's survival relied as much on practical ingenuity as it did on marble, aqueducts, or legislation. Above ground and below, life interwove into a complex, ongoing choreography, each actor, human, animal, or stonework, playing a role in sustaining a city that thrived because it had mastered adaptation more than perfection. Above the labyrinth of sewers, Romans carried the evidence of their city everywhere they went, most visibly on their clothing. Togas, tunics, and the occasional elaborate stola were meant to convey status, refinement, and moral virtue, yet they doubled as a canvas for urban life's unplanned artistry. Street dust, market debris, and the subtle influence of street animals all collected on fabrics in ways that no amount of laundering could entirely erase, creating a patchwork of experience stitched invisibly into everyday attire. Wealthier citizens employed fullers who stomped and scrubbed garments in vats of water, mixed with clay, ash, or fermented liquids, producing a smell that communicated diligence, hygiene, and mild menace to anyone passing nearby. Sort of like a perfume called, "I pay people to handle your filth." Ordinary folks improvised, washing tunics in communal fountains or private cisterns, then draping them over railings or rooftops to dry, balancing exposure to sunlight against curious passers-by who might borrow a piece of laundry or leave a mark that would make its way into tomorrow's outfit. Sandals and footwear were equally revealing, trapping particles of daily life beneath arches and straps, a reminder that every step carried a story. Clothing became more than apparel. It was both record and armor, signaling social rank, mobility, and proximity to the city's chaos while offering some defense against its less glamorous realities. Color, texture, and layering played dual roles, aesthetics and subtle protection against abrasion, dust, and human traffic. Even the most delicate silk or embroidered wool carried traces of prior misadventures, evidence of dust from streets, sparks from hearths, and occasional unplanned interactions with animals or other humans. Hair and head coverings complemented the wardrobe, absorbing airborne dust and stray particles, while veils and caps offered the illusion of polish against the ongoing reality of urban life. Romans treated these imperfections with a mixture of pragmatism and pride. No one expected perfection, but presentation mattered, and minor stains or irregularities became proof of engagement in the city's daily pulse. Clothing, in this sense, acted as a medium for adaptation, a visible negotiation between aspiration and reality, demonstrating that life in Rome demanded practical intelligence as much as social finesse. Each citizen learned to balance elegance, functionality, and resilience, acknowledging that every tunic told a story, Every fold recorded a journey, and every layer represented a daily compromise between style, hygiene, and survival. In essence, garments carried the city's narrative outward, allowing Romans to wear both their ambition and their environment simultaneously. Proof that civilization required not just infrastructure or law, but the skillful management of material life itself. Descending from rooftops draped with drying tunics and veils, Romans entered kitchens that were anything but quiet or sterile, spaces where the reality of domestic life collided with the city's rhythm. Hearths glowed under hanging pots, while flames licked wooden beams and cast unpredictable shadows on walls cluttered with utensils, drying herbs, and storage containers that seemed designed to challenge spatial reasoning. Cooks, often slaves, navigated these tight quarters with practiced agility, chopping, stirring, and flipping ingredients, while dodging curious children, stray animals, or utensils dropped by distracted hands, a daily dance that required timing, focus, and nerves of steel. Meat, fish, and vegetables arrived fresh from markets, sometimes hours earlier, and were handled with pragmatism rather than science. Salt, brine, and heat substituted for preservation, while sharp knives, communal bowls, and porous cutting boards collected a subtle history of prior meals, each layer contributing to flavor, risk, or occasionally a memorable aroma that lingered like an uninvited guest. Water, drawn from nearby fountains or rooftop cisterns, fueled cooking and cleaning, but demanded attention. Too little, and preparations faltered. Too much, and spills or splashes transformed floors into temporary skating rinks, often navigated only by experience and dexterity. Bread dough rose in baskets lined with cloth, while stews simmered over open flames, the smell mingling with smoke, oil, and ambient city odors, creating a signature Rome just lived in scent profile. Storage was improvisational. Amphorae, jars, and woven containers protected ingredients as best as possible from pests, humidity, and the unpredictable curiosity of household animals who had mastered stealthy raids on unattended provisions. Even simple tasks became lessons in adaptation. Stirring a pot required awareness of space, timing, and movement. Washing utensils demanded coordination to avoid collisions, and chopping vegetables often involved negotiating an evolving ecosystem of sound, smell, and human interference. Kitchens were microcosms of the city itself, structured yet chaotic, meticulously planned yet unpredictably influenced by humans, animals, and environmental conditions. Skills passed from one household member to another, from apprentice cook to master, building practical knowledge and resilience alongside culinary output. Every meal prepared was a small negotiation with reality. With the city outside pressing in, supplies arriving at uncertain times, and infrastructure never perfect, success required both ingenuity and patience. In this way, domestic food preparation was a stage for human intelligence and endurance, demonstrating that survival and comfort in Rome depended on more than engineering, laws, or markets. It relied on the dexterity, observation, and adaptive thinking of each resident navigating their own small, intimate slice of urban life. Emerging from the intimate chaos of kitchens and hearths, Romans spilled into the arenas and theaters, where the city's grandeur met human spectacle in full, unapologetic display. Amphitheaters rose like stone beasts, massive and imposing, drawing crowds that jostled for seats, exchanged news, and occasionally evaluated each other's footwear with the same meticulous attention once reserved for kitchens. Gladiators, athletes, and performers navigated sand and wood, their skills honed in sweat-drenched practice yards, while spectators watched with equal parts awe, envy, and barely restrained snacking. Chariots thundered, horses labored under human ambition, and every performance depended on timing, daring, and the occasional improvisation when something inevitably went slightly sideways. Music, shouts, and the clatter of movement filled spaces designed to amplify spectacle, while courtyards and porticos outside carried the echoes into streets still pulsing with trade, conversation, and the remnants of domestic life. Vendors adapted by bringing snacks, drinks, and minor luxuries into the arenas, balancing salesmanship with the unpredictable flow of human traffic, while attendants managed seating, lost items, and the occasional disagreement that flared with comedic timing. Performers themselves adjusted constantly. A misstep, a dropped prop, or an animal wandering unexpectedly into the space could transform a rehearsal-perfect sequence into improvisational brilliance, reminding all that skill alone did not guarantee order. Citizens absorbed this chaos with practiced attention, cheering, hissing, or applauding, depending on social norms, personal taste, and immediate reaction, proving that public entertainment was as much about human psychology as it was about choreography or engineering. Even in moments of triumph, victory parades, elaborate reenactments, or carefully timed executions, the city's underlying unpredictability asserted itself, requiring awareness, judgment, and a willingness to embrace the messy reality of collective experience. The flow of people from streets and homes into these arenas demonstrated the seamless connection between private life and public spectacle. Citizens brought their stories, routines, and expectations with them, merging domestic chaos with orchestrated performance. In this environment, social hierarchy, personal pride, and survival instincts intertwined, creating a dynamic tableau in which observation, adaptation, and engagement were as crucial as courage or talent. Entertainment became a mirror of urban life itself, structured yet fluid, impressive yet vulnerable to disruption, and always demanding participation on multiple levels. The city's genius was revealed not only in the construction of arches, stages, and seating, but in the choreography of humans navigating space, opportunity, and spectacle simultaneously. Life in Rome, therefore, oscillated between intimacy and performance, private and public, demonstrating that the skills honed over daily routines, negotiation, observation, and adaptation were not only essential at home and in markets, but also vital in arenas where the city's collective energy was on full display. After the cheers faded and spectators spilled out of amphitheaters, the city's rhythm guided Romans toward temples, shrines, and altars, spaces where devotion collided with the same improvisational energy that characterized markets and bathhouses. Marble steps, carved columns, and ornate statues projected solemnity and permanence, but the flow of worshippers added unpredictability. Families maneuvered through crowds carrying offerings, priests balanced incense and ritual implements, and stray animals occasionally wandered into the sacred precincts, ignoring the boundary between divine and mundane. Festivals amplified this choreography, with processions of priests, citizens, and performers winding through streets still pulsing from public spectacles, banners fluttering, drums beating, and human voices blending devotion with social gossip. Offerings of grain, wine, and small livestock were placed on altars with care, yet minor mishaps, spilled wine, toppled figurines, or accidentally stepped on sacrificial birds, reminded all that ritual perfection was a hopeful ideal rather than a practical guarantee. Citizens observed each other's devotion, reading hierarchy, wealth, and social capital in gestures, dress, and the quality of offerings, while priests interpreted signs, orchestrated prayers, and occasionally muttered about the human propensity for improvisation. Children ran ahead of processions, mimicking adult behaviors and testing boundaries, while adults navigated crowd flow with awareness born of daily adaptation, integrating ritual observance into the city's ongoing chaos. Even private altars in homes required skill. Offerings had to be prepared, incense lit at the right time, and small statues maintained, all while avoiding interfering with domestic tasks or household animals. Water used for purification, oils applied for sanctity, and flames for illumination intertwined practical utility with symbolic meaning, creating layered experiences in which devotion and survival coexisted. The juxtaposition of sacred architecture with the persistent realities of human behavior highlighted a key truth about Roman life. Civilization, culture, and spirituality were inseparable from adaptability, observation, and the willingness to negotiate unpredictability. Festivals, processions, and daily worship reflected this dynamic. Citizens participated fully, navigating ritual, social expectations, and environmental variables simultaneously, creating an interplay of reverence and pragmatism unique to Rome. In essence, the city's spiritual life was an extension of its broader urban choreography, requiring skill, timing, and awareness, just as markets, baths, or apartment life did, proving that devotion was not exempt from adaptation. Religion in Rome thrived not only because of monumental architecture, priestly hierarchy, or doctrinal design, but because citizens had learned to carry chaos into sacred spaces, transforming unpredictability into ritualized practice and ensuring that both the divine and the human remained in constant, messy dialogue with the city itself. After temples quieted and processions dispersed, the city of Rome revealed itself in full, a sprawling organism where ambition, adaptation, and persistent human improvisation intertwined in ways both magnificent and chaotic. Citizens returned to their insulae, streets still alive with the residual energy of markets, bathhouses, arenas, and sacred rituals, carrying lessons, minor triumphs, and subtle stains from a day fully lived. Animals had settled into their nocturnal patterns. Vendors tidied what could be tidied, and the sewers hummed with the unseen work of gravity, engineering, and occasional human correction, a silent reminder that civilization was as much below as above. Inhabitants navigated stairs, alleys, and courtyards with muscle memory born from decades of negotiating infrastructure, social hierarchy, and everyday unpredictability, proving that the city's splendor relied on coordination, adaptation, and a willingness to embrace imperfection. Clothing dried, meals were digested, and small domestic rituals unfolded, all linked to the same flow of water, food, and human effort that had defined the city since dawn. The grandeur of marble, the calculated arches of aqueducts, and the carefully choreographed arenas and temples contrasted with the improvisational brilliance of daily life, demonstrating that Rome's achievements were inseparable from the practical wisdom of its citizens. Markets, kitchens, baths, and streets had taught observation, negotiation, and patience. Animals reminded humans that they were never the sole protagonists, and rituals highlighted the integration of chaos with purpose, proving that survival, community, and culture were continuous acts of adaptation. Citizens, consciously or not, performed this urban dance daily, moving between public and private, sacred and profane, planned and spontaneous, accumulating knowledge, resilience, and sometimes minor humiliation along the way. The city functioned because it allowed for error, improvisation, and individual initiative, not because it eliminated obstacles. Infrastructure, law, and monumental architecture supported life, but did not replace the intelligence, skill, and attention of those who lived within it. Rome's beauty, power, and cultural achievements emerged not in spite of daily chaos, but alongside it, shaped by citizens who understood that adaptation was a requirement, observation a necessity, and collaboration inevitable. At night, the city rested in a fragile equilibrium. Lights flickered, streets emptied, and the hum of life receded, yet the architecture, water, animals, and human ingenuity remained ready to resume the performance at dawn. Rome, in all its layered, bustling, unpredictable, and occasionally messy glory, existed because humans continuously negotiated with their environment, each other, and the unpredictable rhythm of city life. Its grandeur was inseparable from the everyday improvisations, small victories, and collective resilience that kept it functioning, proving that civilization was as much a product of human skill and adaptability as it was of marble, aqueducts, or law. Life in Rome was messy, magnificent, and entirely unavoidable. The pharaoh had imagined the banquet as a demonstration of divine favor and logistical competence for his glittering court evening. He had ordered mountains of bread, rivers of beer, and enough roasted cattle to intimidate neighboring kingdoms in one sitting. Servants had polished bronze platters until they reflected torchlight like nervous little suns in the long hall that night brightly. Priests had rehearsed blessings with the same intensity other men reserved for battle plans just in case the gods blinked. It was meant to be flawless, the kind of feast that made future historians sigh dramatically in dusty archives later. Instead, the kitchen had become a battlefield of egos, heat, and tragically undercooked goose sweating beside furious supervisors all evening. One ambitious official had insisted on unveiling a new honey glaze imported at absurd expense from lands nobody trusted anyway. Unfortunately, the glaze had fermented during the Nile journey and developed a personality that could have qualified as vengeful chemistry. When it touched the roasted birds, it hissed softly, as if offended by poultry, and released a suspicious perfume cloud. The first nobleman to taste it attempted diplomacy with his expression before quietly collapsing sideways onto expensive reed mats nearby. Musicians kept playing because no one had written a protocol for sudden aristocratic gravity during sacred dinner ceremonies ever recorded. The pharaoh had blinked twice, calculating whether fainting counted as applause in a hierarchical society obsessed with optics and omens. Meanwhile, lesser guests had shoveled food faster, hoping momentum might outrun destiny and avoid whatever curse circulated that night there. Sweat had trickled beneath golden collars while whispers traveled quicker than incense smoke through the increasingly nervous royal court circle. A second tray of honeyed goose had emerged anyway, because confidence sometimes bordered on delusion in kitchens chasing eternal glory. This batch had been worse, aggressively sour, practically philosophical in its bitterness, like it questioned empire and digestive loyalty simultaneously. Several officials had excused themselves with theatrical calm and then sprinted for the courtyard shadows behind towering painted columns nearby. Priests started chanting louder, improvising spiritual damage control with impressive lung capacity, as if volume alone might reverse fermentation physics. The pharaoh finally sampled the glaze, perhaps out of pride, perhaps out of denial in front of everyone watching closely. He did not collapse, which only complicated the narrative and confused the gossip swirling through servants' corridors and palace balconies. Instead, he declared the flavor bold, visionary, aggressively unforgettable, a culinary revolution blessed by unpredictable gods with chaotic humor intact. Everyone applauded with the fragile enthusiasm of people who preferred breathing over honesty in volatile, royal dining situations like this. Later chronicles had praised the feast as daring and spiritually transformative, without detailing the discreet midnight stomach rebellions that followed. History had moved on politely, leaving behind only a faint warning about trusting experimental honey at scale for sacred banquets. The Persian king had hosted his banquet as a diplomatic chess move disguised as generosity. A glittering spread arranged beneath carved cedar beams and embroidered canopies heavy with gold thread. Silver platters had carried saffron rice jeweled with barberries, lamb stewed until it surrendered, pomegranates split open like theatrical props. Courtiers reclined on cushions that probably cost more than small villages, speaking softly about loyalty while studying one another's hands around the goblets. It had been a night designed for alliances, the kind sealed not by signatures, but by synchronized swallowing. The king had understood that in his empire, conversation was foreplay, and wine was leverage. So the wine had been plentiful, dark, and poured by attendants trained to notice everything and remember nothing, at least officially. Unofficially, half the room had been conducting silent investigations, because someone, inevitably, had decided that a banquet was the perfect place to test ambition with poison. The trouble had begun with a minor governor who had risen too quickly and smiled too broadly. He had laughed a little louder than protocol allowed, had complimented the king's military strategy with just enough enthusiasm to sound rehearsed. When the goblets had been refilled, the rhythm of the evening had shifted by a breath. It was subtle, a pause, a glance, a servant's wrist trembling just slightly. The governor had lifted his cup with confident flourish, perhaps imagining a future chapter starring himself. He had taken one swallow, then another. His expression had changed not dramatically, but with a slow confusion, like a man rereading a sentence that suddenly refused to make sense. The conversation had continued around him for 3 whole heartbeats before he exhaled too long and failed to inhale again. No one had screamed. Persian court etiquette had not allowed for shrieking. It preferred elegance even in catastrophe. The king had watched with eyes trained by years of intrigue. He had not touched his own goblet. Instead, he had asked for music. The musicians had obeyed, strings vibrating over the hush like a silk curtain drawn over a stain. Attendants had carried the governor away as though relocating an inconvenient cushion. Whispers had traveled, but carefully, never rising above respectful volume. The wine had remained on the table, glowing in lamplight with quiet menace. Some guests had drunk anyway, wagering on their insignificance. Others had discreetly switched cups, just in case fate could be confused. By the time the final course arrived, alliances had subtly rearranged themselves. The message had been received without proclamation. Proximity to power required a sturdy stomach and an even sturdier instinct for danger. In the chronicles, the evening had been recorded as a magnificent celebration of imperial unity. The governor's name had been omitted, which was its own form of conclusion. The Roman emperor had arranged his banquet less as a meal and more as a spectacle of appetite, because in Rome, excess had practically qualified as a civic virtue. The dining room had glittered with mosaics depicting gods who looked mildly exhausted by human behavior, while fountains trickled wine into shallow basins for dramatic effect. Guests had reclined on couches in careful order of status, each placement a quiet announcement of who mattered and who merely existed in the background. Slaves had circulated with trays of dormice stuffed with herbs, flamingo tongues arranged like trophies, and sauces so complicated they felt like arguments. It had all been engineered to impress foreign envoys and intimidate domestic rivals in one theatrical sweep. The emperor had loved novelty. He had believed boredom to be a greater threat than rebellion, so he had demanded surprises. One evening's masterpiece had involved a ceiling installation designed to release flower petals upon cue showering the guests in perfumed approval. The mechanism had been ambitious, which in Rome often meant structurally optimistic. As the fourth course arrived, featuring seafood transported at heroic speed from distant coasts, the emperor had lifted his hand to signal the grand moment. Musicians had paused. Conversations had stalled. The ceiling had responded, but not with petals. Instead, a cascade of heavy plaster fragments and poorly secured garlands had descended in chaotic enthusiasm. The first impact had shattered a platter. The second had caught a senator directly on the shoulder. The third had convinced everyone that perhaps gravity was not impressed by imperial ambition. Panic had flickered across faces trained for composure. Some guests had tried to maintain dignity while disentangling themselves from decorative debris. Others had abandoned decorum entirely, scrambling over couches with startling athleticism for men accustomed to being carried. The emperor had stood, robes dusted white, expression caught between fury and disbelief. Engineers had been summoned instantly because someone always had to explain why brilliance had turned into renovation. In the confusion, oil lamps had tipped, and for a tense moment the air had hinted at smoke. Slaves had rushed to smother the threat before it matured into legend. The banquet had limped onward because Romans had believed that stopping would look weak. Wine had continued to flow, though now it tasted faintly of plaster. Later writers had framed the incident as a testament to the emperor's bold architectural experimentation. The injured senator had been described as dramatically devoted to the spectacle. What had actually lingered was the uneasy awareness that even ceilings could betray a ruler obsessed with grandeur. Rome had loved extravagance, but it had also quietly feared the cost of performing it too aggressively. The medieval wedding feast had been planned as a reconciliation disguised as romance, because two rival houses had decided that matrimony sounded cheaper than war. Long trestle tables had filled the drafty great hall, sagging under trenchers of roasted boar, wheels of cheese sweating near the hearth, and pies sealed so tightly they looked defensive. Banners from both families had hung side by side, fabric practically bristling with inherited grudges. The bride and groom had sat elevated on a dais, smiling with the slightly brittle cheer of people aware that their union had footnotes. Minstrels had played loudly, partly to celebrate, partly to drown out murmured assessments of who had arrived armed. The ale had been generous and suspiciously strong, as if someone had hoped intoxication might blur decades of resentment. At first, the evening had seemed almost hopeful. A toast had been offered, another had followed, laughter had risen, cautious but real. Then a serving boy, moving too quickly through a narrow gap, had collided with a knight whose temper had always lived near the surface. The knight's goblet had overturned, dark liquid staining an embroidered sleeve that belonged to the opposing clan's patriarch. It was a small accident. It should have remained small. Instead, silence had dropped like a portcullis. The patriarch had regarded the stain as though it were a deliberate insult woven into the fabric of history. Words had been exchanged, quiet but edged. A cousin had stepped forward, hand resting on sword hilt, out of habit more than strategy. The bride had stiffened. The groom had attempted diplomacy, voice cracking in the smoky air. Someone had laughed at precisely the wrong moment. Steel had flashed before reason could intervene. The first strike had not killed anyone. It had simply punctured the fragile illusion that this gathering had ever been safe. Benches had overturned. Platters had crashed to the rush-covered floor. Guests had scrambled between loyalty and survival, choosing sides with alarming speed. The minstrels had stopped mid-note, instruments abandoned like irrelevant accessories. By the time guards restored a tense semblance of order, several men had bled into the same straw that had cushioned their earlier merriment. The wedding had technically concluded, vows already spoken, but the alliance had fractured before dessert. Chroniclers later described the incident as an unfortunate misunderstanding amplified by wine. That phrasing felt generous. In truth, the feast had revealed that grudges, when seated at the same table, required only the lightest nudge to stand up armed. The marriage endured on parchment, the feud resumed in practice, and the hall, scrubbed and repaired, never quite lost the echo of that overturned goblet. The Tudor court had been obsessed with spectacle, especially when it came to sugar, which had arrived from faraway lands as if it were alchemy in crystalline form. Royal chefs had sculpted elaborate towers, castles, and animals, sometimes so detailed that nobles debated whether the swan centerpiece should be eaten or admired for its life choices. Tables had groaned under confectionery, and servants had tiptoed past trays like museum attendants, carrying candied delicacies that smelled impossibly sweet and occasionally faintly suspicious. For all the artistry, the reality of sugar was less forgiving than courtly protocol. Humidity, careless handling, and a single overeager guest could transform a masterpiece into a sticky, wobbly disaster. On this particular afternoon, a new confection had arrived, a towering sugar castle with spires sharp enough to rival daggers, fortified with caramel battlements. The king had admired it, with all the politeness his royal upbringing demanded, while casting a speculative glance at the nearest noble, wondering who might be blamed if disaster struck. As the feast proceeded, conversation had flowed easily, lubricated by wine and the casual assumption that this banquet would cement loyalty. No one, however, had accounted for the subtle tremor caused by the evening's music, or the curiosity of young pages testing whether the structure could bear minimal pressure. A gentle prod had escalated quickly when a foot had nudged the castle just slightly. Sugar spires had begun to shiver. Guests had shifted in their seats, wine glasses half lifted as the castle surrendered to gravity. First the towers had toppled, then walls crumbled, sending shards of caramel raining onto platters of roasted fowl. Screams had been careful, restrained, because decorum demanded that one not shriek over sugar unless genuinely necessary. One lady had fainted, caught by her neighbor, creating a domino effect of swooning that complicated the cleanup efforts considerably. The king had clapped, a nervous diplomatic gesture, signaling amusement while secretly worrying about stains on his velvet sleeves. Servants had rushed to scoop sugar shards before sticky floors caused further injury, while some nobles had made strategic retreats to avoid sticky shoes or reputation-damaging slips. By the time the banquet resumed, the sugar castle had been reduced to a molten puddle, glimmering dangerously in candlelight. Chroniclers later described the spectacle as delightful ingenuity and a minor misadventure, but in whispered accounts, it had been a vivid reminder that even the most carefully constructed grandeur could collapse under trivial curiosity. For weeks afterward, the servants had recounted the sugar castle's demise with a mixture of awe and relief, because no one had wanted to repeat the sticky lesson of over-ambition and brittle elegance. The Mughal emperor had presided over his palace with a taste for excess so refined that every spice was a statement and every dish a declaration of empire. Courtiers had whispered about saffron threads worth more than estates, while cooks prepared stews that required careful timing and precise temperature over 100 copper vessels. Platters had emerged in synchronized waves, each more fragrant and vividly colored than the last. Lambs perfumed with rosewater, fish lacquered in cardamom, rice dotted with jewels of dried fruits. The emperor had observed with slow satisfaction, sampling delicately as if each bite confirmed his dominion over both land and flavor. Guests had attempted to keep pace, nibbling cautiously to avoid embarrassment while juggling the subtle politics of spice. But opulence had its hazards. Some dishes had arrived over-seasoned, others undercooked, while a single tray carried a mysterious powder that had smelled faintly metallic and just slightly wrong. One prince, eager to impress and perhaps misjudge his immunity, had sampled liberally, ignoring discreet glances from attendants. Within the hour, his color had shifted from healthy flush to a sallow tone that suggested internal rebellion. Murmurs had rippled, carefully restrained, because the etiquette of Mughal courts demanded composure even as stomachs betrayed their masters. The emperor had not flinched, maintaining a calm as precise as his seasoning, while attendants discreetly carried the afflicted prince to a side chamber. The guests had proceeded with a tense rhythm, aware that proximity to power came with both splendor and risk, yet compelled to continue because the feast had been designed as a living assertion of imperial vitality. Over the next course, more subtle illnesses had made themselves known, each traced back to a combination of spices, storage errors, and the natural unpredictability of human digestion under opulent strain. The courtiers had navigated the shifting atmosphere with the careful diplomacy of chess masters, avoiding eye contact when someone gasped, leaning slightly to conceal discomfort, offering smiles of appropriate sympathy. Chroniclers would later describe the evening as extraordinary in flavor and refinement, omitting the quiet chaos behind gilded doors, the whispered prayers for safe digestion, and the careful management of appearances. In retrospect, the feast had served its purpose beyond mere nourishment. It had reminded everyone that lavishness demanded respect, that power was inseparable from perception, and that even the most meticulously prepared banquet could harbor quiet threats. The spices had lingered in memory and in the stomachs of the unfortunate as a subtle testament to the precarious balance between indulgence and overreach, leaving the court forever aware that brilliance carried consequences even in the form of a perfectly spiced biryani. At Versailles, the king had imagined a banquet that would showcase wealth, taste, and an unshakable sense of control, though what actually happened had proven that control was optional when kitchens and gossip mingled freely. The dining hall had glimmered under crystal chandeliers, walls lined with mirrors multiplying both light and scrutiny, and tables set with silver so polished that the reflection of every wig, every jeweled cuff, was unavoidable. Guests had arrived in layers of silk and satin, each more elaborately scented than the next, and conversation had begun with careful compliments and veiled judgments. Chefs had unveiled dishes that seemed to require their own architects, featuring sculpted pastries, gilded fruits, and sauces so intricate that tasting them felt like performing a delicate ritual. Yet behind the grandeur, the palace staff had been operating at peak chaos, balancing flambéed dishes, carrying platters through corridors slick with polished marble, and dodging wandering courtiers who insisted on observing everything. The first mishap had arrived quietly. A roasted swan, perched dramatically atop a bed of herbs, had been carried too close to a candle and caught just enough heat to start a small flare. Guests had recoiled politely, wine glasses frozen mid-air, while the kitchen staff rushed with wet towels and practiced urgency that concealed panic. Amid the tension, whispered gossip had flowed like wine, rumors moving faster than the extinguishing of flames, connecting a noble's remark to a potential scandal in seconds. The king had remained calm, face unreadable, though an attendant had noted the subtle tightening of his jaw. Despite the near disaster, the banquet had continued, now with heightened awareness that the spectacle was as much about survival as indulgence. As courses progressed, minor calamities, spilled sauces, tipping trays, A sudden collapse of a sugar sculpture had punctuated the opulent proceedings, each incident provoking polite laughter that hid genuine astonishment. By dessert, guests had begun to measure their admiration not just for culinary skill, but for stamina, both theirs and the palace staff's, navigating hazards with discretion. Chroniclers would later portray the evening as a triumph of elegance and courtly magnificence, glossing over the small crises that had threatened to overshadow the king's intended display. In truth, the feast had been a delicate dance of aesthetics, timing, and whispered negotiation, proving that in Versailles, brilliance was inseparable from careful choreography, and that even glittering kitchens could conceal simmering chaos. The palace had remained radiant long after guests departed, but the echo of spilled sauces, hissing flames, and tightly contained panic had lingered, a quiet reminder that grandeur always flirted with disaster. The final imperial supper in Russia had been arranged with a sense of inevitability, as if the grandeur of the Romanovs could somehow postpone the collapse of circumstance itself. Chandeliers had glittered like frozen suns over tables set with porcelain, silver, and crystal, while platters carried foods imported from distant lands, preserved with care that sometimes bordered on obsession. Every detail had been calculated to impress foreign dignitaries, nobles, and visiting officials, yet the atmosphere had carried the subtle tension of people aware that opulence was only a thin veneer over fragile human endurance. The emperor had presided at the head of the table, robes heavy with embroidery, expression carefully neutral, while servants moved with near military precision, adjusting forks, polishing glasses, and noting who had lingered too long over wine refills. Courses had arrived in sequence, each one more elaborate than the last. Caviar, accompanied by delicate blinis, stewed game fowl with rich sauces, vegetables glazed with exotic honey imported at great expense. Guests had sampled, complimented, and nodded with a mixture of awe and practiced restraint, while courtiers had watched the interactions as closely as the food, noting alliances, gestures, and subtle hints of disfavor. Yet in the midst of luxury, the inevitable had emerged. A delicate fish dish, overseasoned in its preparation, had triggered mild but widespread illness among those seated in the midsection of the table. Panic had been measured, polite, disguised as careful coughing and subtle adjustments to napkins, but it had spread like a quiet rumor that no one could quite ignore. Physicians had been summoned with discreet urgency, tasting broths, checking pulses, and issuing reassurances that balanced truth with diplomacy. The emperor had maintained his composure, yet his gaze had lingered on the offending dish, perhaps calculating which servant or cook would bear the weight of blame when history asked for a convenient culprit. As dessert was served, sugar-spun confections, tarts, and candied fruits, the guests had recovered enough to continue conversation, though a subtle tension had remained, as if the memory of discomfort had sharpened every glance and half-smile. Chroniclers would later describe the supper as exquisite, memorable, and entirely befitting imperial dignity, a narrative that ignored the delicate dance of managing misfortune in real time. Behind the scenes, the staff had quietly catalogued every mistake, every subtle misjudgment of temperature or timing, aware that this banquet might be cited in future judgments of competence or failure. In retrospect, the supper had demonstrated the dual nature of lavishness. It could inspire awe and loyalty, but it could also expose vulnerability, reminding everyone present that even the most powerful empires were tethered to human frailty, and that no amount of gilding could fully shield a gathering from disaster.